everybody. Welcome to our Bible study together. And if you're just scrolling along Facebook and you come across this, hey, special welcome. Thank you for joining with us tonight. And I want to make this Bible study available to our church. And I want to be an encouragement to each and every person here this evening. I want to give you a Bible study tonight as it concerns the fear factor. You know, we're living in a time right now where there's a lot of fear going on. And let's talk about fear for a second. When I was a kid, I had an incredible imagination. I think I still do. But when I was a kid, I could imagine the most hideous, most incredible monster that ever walked on the face of the earth. I used to imagine that monster stalked me. You know, I saw him once in the shower, and ever since then, I'd kind of keep the shower curtain open a little bit so that hideous monster wouldn't attack me. I saw him once under my bed, and for several years, when I get up in the morning, I'd jump out of bed. I wouldn't get out of bed, I'd jump out of bed. And that was just being a kid. Let me ask you a question. What were you afraid of as a child? Were you afraid of the dark? Were you afraid of thunderstorms, crossing bridges, spiders, snakes, heights, people? I kind of like to call it the booger man. But as I got older, my fear for monsters turned to fear for people. See, crowds used to make me really anxious. I used to hate public speaking in high school and college. I was that guy that tried to be sick when I had to do some public speaking. But you know, as God had a sense of humor making me a pastor. And I think back to those times and you know, public speaking happens all the time for me now, but back in those days, I used to hate it. But we look back at our childhood fears, and most of us continue to battle a variety of adult fears every day. We have fears every day we face. Let me tell you some fears here. Losing a job, getting sick, running out of money, going bankrupt, getting a divorce, being betrayed by the ones we love. The more we allow fear into our lives, the more we struggle to grow spiritually. See, fear poisons us a little bit each day and pollutes that spirit of thanksgiving if we don't face it head on and overcome its power. Fear, if we allow it to overcome us, weighs us down. It prevents us from traveling through life with speed and grace. In way of introduction to this Bible study this evening, most of our adult fears, I read this once, I want to share this with you. Most of our adult fears fall into four categories. And let me give you these four categories. The first one is fear of loss. Most of our adult fears fall into the category of fear of loss. The fear of loss is one of our basic human fears. And this can take many forms. We fear losing our spouse. We fear losing our children. We fear something bad happening to our spouse or children. We fear financial loss. We fear job loss. We fear investing loss. We fear loss of control. Every one of you can identify some type of fear of loss that you're dealing with right now. Have you ever feared losing before? Let me ask you a question. What are you most afraid of losing right now? Here's another category that we fear when it comes to the categories of adult fears. Here's another one. Fear of failure. A lot of people would love to tackle some challenge they've always dreamed about, but they're afraid they may not be successful or what they consider to be successful. Maybe you wanted to start your own business and then you thought, I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe you felt a burden to start a ministry in an area which you're really passionate about. Maybe you can't help thinking, I just don't think I'm good enough at it. Maybe you'd like to sing or play an instrument or teach a class, and you fear failure at it. You see, fear of failure can paralyze us from starting any new endeavor. Maybe it's launching a business, going back to school, pursuing a relationship, or just even reaching out to somebody with a phone call that you hadn't talked to for years. You're not sure if you'll be able to do it, so you never even try. That's the power of the fear of failure. What are you afraid of failing at? Ask yourself that question. Here's another category. that kind of categorizes our adult fears, and that's fear of rejection. Many of us fear rejection and abandonment. Other people are just controlled by a people-pleasing mindset that's anchored in that fear of rejection. They want everybody to accept them, so they wonder, will she like this hairstyle? What if I don't agree to this? Or I better go if they won't like me, or I don't want to upset anybody if I have to. Are you ever afraid that people might not like you as you are? That's another category. Let me give you the fourth category. We've looked at the fear of loss, the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, and the fear of the unknown. Finally, many of us dread not knowing what lies ahead, the future. What if questions. I mentioned this in a previous study last week. Many people can't help wondering things like, what if I get sick with some serious illness? Or what if that happens to somebody I love? You worry about things you cannot control. What if I lose my job? What's going to happen in the future? What if no one truly likes me or loves me? What are you afraid of knowing? What would you prefer to stay in the dark about? What's going to happen in this world? Is the end near? We fear these things. Let me define for you this evening what fear is. It's an internal warning cry that danger is nearby and we had better do something about it. It is designed to be a self-correcting mechanism, to be unpleasant enough to motivate us to take action and remove ourselves from whatever is threatening us. And it readies our body. It's a natural emotion, God-given emotion. It readies our body to flee, to hide, or fight. For example, there is such thing as good fear. Give you an example. When you're about to get hit by a car, or chased by a homicidal maniac, or about to touch a hot stove, or something that keeps you from driving recklessly, that's good fear. That's really good fear. Then there's bad fear, the fear that overcomes us. The problem is that for most of us, fear strikes when it's neither helpful or wanted. It can get attached to what does not truly threaten us and become paralyzing instead of motivating. When this happens, we become worriers. What's worry? Fear caused by an external source, while worry and anxiety is produced from the inside. And it is fear of the future. Both produce the same physical responses. However, let me talk about that fear that threatens us as believers, or the believers for getting right with God and moving on in our Christian life. And that fear, if you don't know Christ, that it keeps you from getting right with God and accepting Christ and trusting and obeying God with your lives. There is a fear there. Look, when we give into fear, when we give into that fear, there is a high cost attached to it. Let me give you the cost of giving in to your fear. Fear is okay, but allowing it to overcome you has a high cost. I'll give you an example. Loss of confidence due to continual avoidance. There's loss of destiny due to lack of risk-taking in life. There is loss of joy because fear destroys joy. Loss of authentic intimacy. Due to that original sin in the garden, we have been hiding ever since. We hide behind smiles we don't really feel, behind agreeable words we really don't believe, mostly behind things we truly feel and believe but refuse to say. Loss of availability to God because it distorts how we think about Him, and it will get passed from generation to generation due to that example of a father to a son. Trust and fear have been battling each other for the human heart a long time now. You're either going to trust or you're going to fear. Eventually, one or the other is going to win in your life. So with this in mind, I want to look at the Bible today. Let's examine the fear factor as it's presented in this text. Matthew chapter 14, and in verse 22 through 23. Let me read this to you. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when the evening was come, he was alone there. So, let's set the stage for you based on this particular passage of Scripture. In verse 22 and 23, Jesus has just fed the 5,000. It's evening. It's starting to get dark. He sends Peter and the rest of the disciples into a boat across the Sea of Galilee, while he sends the multitudes he just fed back home. Jesus then goes up to a mountain to be alone and pray. By night, a major unexpected storm blew in. Notice verse 24. Matthew 14, verse 24. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Storms would come unexpectedly on the Sea of Galilee due to the fact of its geography and differences in temperatures. Let me explain this to you. If you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, you can see this, because the water can be calm one minute, and just like that, it can get crazy the next. You see, the Sea of Galilee is a 13-mile by 7-mile lake that lies 680 feet below sea level. The sea itself is surrounded by hills that reach nearly 1,400 feet above sea level, and the mountains of the Golden Heights, or the Bible calls it Decapolis, and it reaches 2,400 feet above sea level. So the heights of these hills are a source of cool and dry air. Directly around the sea, the climate is semi-tropical with warm and moist air. So the large difference in height between the surrounding land and the low of the sea, it causes large temperature and pressure changes. So if a strong east wind blows cool air over the warm air that covers the sea, the cold air, being heavier, drops as the warm air rises. The contrasting air masses, they meet and they descend directly to the center, causing a storm to arise quickly and without warning. This sudden change can produce a surprisingly furious and violent storm in a short time. Another thing is that the Sea of Galilee is shallow, just 200 feet at its greatest depth. So a shallow lake whipped up by wind more rapidly than deep water, where energy is more readily absorbed. So if you look at this meteorological phenomenon here, waves in this storm on the Sea of Galilee can go up to 10 feet high. So we see that they're in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is not with them. Jesus is up on a mountain praying. The disciples are fearful. They give in to the fear factor. To themselves, they are probably saying, Jesus sent us, we obeyed, this storm came suddenly, we're still at sea, we're going to die. They are experiencing what you and I experience every day, and that is the fear factor. In my life, in your life, storms will come suddenly. Who would have thought 3 weeks ago we'd be where we're at 3 weeks later? In our country, in our communities, in our homes. See, life is lived going in a storm, in the midst of the storm, or coming out of the storm. So the question I want to submit to you based upon this text is that when the storms of life come, will you give in to fear, or will you continue to trust the Lord? When the storms of life come, will you give in to fear, or will you continue to trust the Lord? This answer lies, as we look at the text, in 3 ways the fear factor can do in our lives if we allow it to overcome us. Let's notice 3 elements of the text. 3 elements of this text here in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 through verse 33. And these 3 elements, the waves, a boat, and the wind. The waves, a boat, and the wind. So let's look at number 1 when we consider the waves. In verse 24, their fear factor torments me with waves of doubt. The fear factor torments me with waves of doubt. Let's look at verse 24. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Why does the fear factor torment me with waves of doubt, just like it tormented the disciples with waves of doubt? Well, how about the terror of the sea? Notice that they were in the midst of the sea. There's a loneliness there. There's a terror there. In that day, Jewish people, they feared large bodies of water. See, biblical writers symbolically referred to the sea as an abyss, And they saw it as a symbol of chaos and hell, of terror, of danger, a fearsome place of darkness and chaos. Few could swim, and fishermen, even fishermen, avoided deep water. So when this storm arose at night, now you know what's going through the minds of every guy on this boat. Extreme fear, terror. In our lives, extreme fear and terror can produce loneliness and doubt in our lives, causing us to give into the fear factor. I thought about this. Not only is it the terror of the sea, but also the tossing of the waves. Matthew here says, and Matthew is writing first person account. Matthew's in this boat. He's reflecting upon when he was younger under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And Matthew says the boat was tossed by the waves. Now remember how high these waves were getting. It was so violent, the only thing the disciples could do was keep the boat upright. They were working hard and not getting anywhere with the boat. So let's put ourselves in this account. This must have been a violent storm if it was strong enough to keep seasoned professional fishermen struggling just to avoid being capsized. Imagine the size of the waves, the strength of the wind, the darkness of night. Hey, and no Dramamine. The waves are crashing, the wind's at gale force. It's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're pretty terrified. Think about all the things in life that are like waves that toss us around. Work demands, parental demands, leadership demands, just the busyness and demands of life. It tosses us around and we're tired and we begin to be afraid and we doubt. The fear factor, the waves of doubt. Let's look at number 2. The fear factor, we looked at the waves, now let's look at the boat. The fear factor keeps me in the boat of my security. Let's read verse 25 through 29 if you've got your Bibles open there in Matthew 14. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Here's number 2. Not only is the fear factor toss me the waves of doubt, but the fear factor keeps me in the boat of my security. The fear factor keeps me in the boat of my security. Even though Jesus is walking by, there in verse 25 and 26, it's the 4th watch. It's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. And I would imagine the disciples at this point are just wanting to stay alive. Matthew does point out from his recollections, he was in the boat that night. Jesus often comes when he's least expected. Jesus often comes when he's least expected. 3 to 4 a.m. They're in the middle of a dark and dangerous storm. Notice they're in the midst of the storm. They're tending to the boat because the boat is their only security of staying alive in this storm. They're in a lot of fear. And when we're in fear, we stay with that security. For them, that boat is the security. And then one of the disciples notice a shadow walking on the water. And as it gets closer, it's a figure of a man walking on the water, but this just wasn't any man. This was Jesus Christ walking by. In the midst of the storm, we feel alone. In the midst of the storm, we wonder if we should have gone in the first place. In the midst of the storm, we tend to our only sense of security, keeping the boat afloat. In the midst of the storm, it is very hard to see Jesus walking by, but he is walking by. Walking on the water. This proves to me, and this should prove to you, that Jesus, the Son of God, is in control of the storm. He's in control over creation. He is in control over everything. So the disciples are in distress, tending to the boat, and the very person who was able to help them was approaching. But they didn't recognize him. They thought he was a ghost. Remember their superstition about the water and the abyss. They were terrified. They cried out in fear. And in hindsight, we may wonder how they could have failed to know it was Jesus. Who else could it be? Matthew wants us to know here that sometimes it takes eyes of faith to recognize when Jesus is around. Often in the middle of the storm, tormented by the waves of disappointment and doubt, keeping the boat afloat, we are no better at recognizing his presence than they were. The problem is this: what sense am I looking through? Do I see Jesus, or do I see just a ghost? Are we tending to our boat that we miss Jesus? But I see also in verse 27 and 28, Jesus is assuring us, though the storm is raging, eyesight is dim, they're having a hard time seeing that it was the Lord. They think it's a ghost, but they hear his voice. The voice of the Lord. Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid. 12 disciples sat in the boat, and we don't know how 11 of them responded to that voice. Confusion, wonder, fear, disbelief, maybe everything. But we do know how Peter responded. Jesus, if it's really you, picture in the middle of the storm, and they're shouting at each other because of the winds and the waves. Jesus, if it's really you, bid me come to thee on the water. Where is our focus on these moments when Jesus is assuring us? Is it on him, or is it in our boat of security? Notice Jesus is inviting. Verse 29. Now, Mark chapter 6, verse 48, Mark's account tells us that Jesus intended to pass them by on the water. And when they saw him walking in the lake, they thought it was a ghost. Why did Jesus want to pass them by? Well, the Greek word for this is an Old Testament technical term used to refer to a theophany, an appearance of Jesus in his glory. These are those defining moments when God made striking and temporary appearances in the earthly realm to select an individual or group for the purpose of communicating a message. For example, God put Moses in the cleft of the rock so while Moses could see him while the glory passes by and the Lord passed by him. God told Elijah to stand on the mountain for the Lord was about to pass by. There's a pattern to these stories. In each case, God had to get the people's attention through a burning bush, a wind and a fire, walking on the water. With each person, God was going to call them to do something extraordinary. In each situation, the person that God called felt afraid. But every time that person said yes to God, yes to their calling, they experienced the power of God in their lives. So Jesus comes to the disciples on the water, intending to pass them by, and he was not just doing some neat magic trick. He was revealing his divine presence and power there in the midst of the sea, in the middle of a storm. And only God, the Creator God, who created everything, you and me, who manifests himself in his Son, can do such a thing. It is interesting that the disciples entered the boat in the first place at Jesus' command. They would have to learn, as we do, that obedience is no guarantee of being spared adversity. But now that the storm had their full attention, Jesus decided it was time the disciples got to know a little bit more about the person who's piloting this thing. So through this, we see Peter recognizing that God was present even in the most unlikely place, realizes that this was an extraordinary opportunity for spiritual adventure and growth. So he responds to Jesus' invitation. Hey, come. Those divinely appointed, defining moments come to you and come to me when we're least expected. He is still asking his followers, his disciples, to do extraordinary things. And if you're not looking for him, he might just pass you by. You might miss him. If you're too concerned about the storm and the boat of your security and being overcome by your fear, you might just miss Jesus walking right past you in the midst of that storm. Why? Because we're overcome with fear. We've looked at the wind. We've looked at the boats. Let's look at the third thing in verse 30. The fear factor preoccupies me with the winds of obstacles. What's the winds of obstacles? Let's look at verse 30 in the Word. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. There's a loss of confidence here. Remember the conditions. It's raining, it's windy, it's wavy, you're tossed about in the middle of the sea, and Jesus invites you to come, walk with me. Peter has a sudden insight into what Jesus is doing. And the Lord is passing by, and he's inviting him to go on the adventure of a life. But he's scared to death. Jesus says, come, trust, jump. Fear says no. Peter, though he's scared, he gets out of the boat and he starts walking. Eyes fixed on Jesus, surrendering himself and abandoning himself utterly to the power of Jesus. Suddenly, an ordinary human being is walking on water. For a moment, in the midst of that storm, everything is smooth. Peter is walking on the water toward Jesus, eyes fixed on him. But fear struck a second time. Peter gets his eyes off of Jesus and he sees the wind around him. He sees what Matthew calls a boisterous wind, and he becomes frightened. He loses his confidence. Reality sets in and Peter goes, what was I thinking? He realizes, I am standing on top of the water in the midst of a storm. I'm out of my boat's security and I'm terrified. His response to the wind and the storm was to give in to fear, and he takes his eyes off Jesus. He loses that sense of confidence that Jesus was the master of the situation, because you see, my friend, our eyes should be focused on Christ. He is our confidence. His focus shifted from the Savior to the storm. He's sinking now in worry. Peter begins to sink. Loss of confidence, and he starts to worry. He just didn't sink in the water. He sank in his own anxiety and worry, and that's what that does to us. I believe the reason God says, fear not, 366 times in all the Bible is that fear will sink us faster than anything else. Fear disrupts faith, and it becomes the single biggest obstacle to trusting and obeying God. We've looked at the waves. We've looked at the boat. We've looked at the wind. As we've seen by these three examples in this text, the fear factor can overcome you and overcome me if we allow it to, killing the joyful, thanksgiving spirit in the heart of the Christian. What's your wave today? What's your boat? What's your wind? I'm going to close now, and we'll pick back up on this on Friday. And I want to look at an application to this text. 2 takeaways from this text, because we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining with us. God bless you.